Chapter 6, Part 2 of Airplane Flying Handbook, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bruce Kachuk. Airplane Flying Handbook, Volume 1, by Federal Aviation Administration. Chapter 6, Ground Reference Maneuvers, Part 2, S-turns across a road. An S-turn across a road is a practice maneuver in which the airplane's ground track describes semicircles of equal radii on each side of a selected straight line on the ground. See Figure 6-5. The straight line may be a road, fence, railroad, or section line that lies perpendicular to the wind and should be of sufficient length for making a series of turns. A constant altitude should be maintained throughout the maneuver. S-turns across a road present one of the most elementary problems in the practical application of the turn and in the correction for wind drift in turns. While the application of this maneuver is considerably less advanced in some respects than the rectangular course, it is taught after the student has been introduced to that maneuver in order that the student may have a knowledge of the correction for wind drift in straight flight along a reference line before the student attempt to correct for drift by playing a turn. The objectives of S-turns across a road are to develop the ability to compensate for drift during turns, orient the flight path with ground references, follow an assigned ground track, arrive at specified points on assigned headings, and divide the pilot's attention. The maneuver consists of crossing the road at a 90-degree angle and immediately beginning a series of 180-degree turns of uniform radius in opposite directions, recrossing the road at a 90-degree angle just as each 180-degree turn is completed. To accomplish a constant radius ground track requires a changing roll rate and angle of bank to establish the wind correction angle. Both will increase or decrease as ground speed increases or decreases. The bank must be steepest when beginning the turn on the downwind side of the road and must be shallowed gradually as the turn progresses from a downwind heading to an upwind heading. On the upwind side, the turn should be started with a relatively shallow bank and then gradually steepened as the airplane turns from an upwind heading to a downwind heading. In this maneuver, the airplane should be rolled from one bank directly into the opposite, just as the reference line on the ground is crossed. Before starting the maneuver, a straight ground reference line or road that lies 90 degrees to the direction of the wind should be selected, then the area checked to ensure that no obstructions or other aircraft are in the immediate vicinity. The road should be approached from the upwind side, at the selected altitude on a downwind heading. When directly over the road, the first turn should be started immediately. With the airplane headed downwind, the ground speed is greatest, and the rate of departure from the road will be rapid, so the roll into the steep bank must be fairly rapid to attain the proper wind correction angle. This prevents the airplane from flying too far from the road and from establishing a ground track of excessive radius. During the latter portion of the first 90 degrees of turn, when the airplane's heading is changing from a downwind heading to a crosswind heading, the ground speed becomes less and the rate of departure from the road decreases. The wind correction angle will be at the maximum when the airplane is headed directly crosswind. After turning 90 degrees, the airplane's heading becomes more and more an upwind heading. The ground speed will decrease, and the rate of closure with the road will become slower. If a constant steep bank were maintained, the airplane would turn too quickly for the slower rate of closure, and would be headed perpendicular to the road prematurely. Because of the decreasing ground speed and rate of closure while approaching the upwind heading, it will be necessary to gradually shallow the bank during the remaining 90 degrees of the semicircle, so that the wind correction angle is removed completely and the wings become level as the 180-degree turn is completed at the moment the road is reached. At the instant the road is being crossed again, a turn in the opposite direction should be started. Since the airplane is still flying into the headwind, the ground speed is relatively slow. Therefore, the turn will have to be started with a shallow bank so as to avoid an excessive rate of turn that would establish the maximum wind correction angle too soon. The degree of bank should be that which is necessary to attain the proper wind correction angle, so the ground track describes an arc, the same size as the one established on the downwind side. Since the airplane is turning from an upwind to a downwind heading, the ground speed will increase, and after turning 90 degrees, the rate of closure with the road will increase rapidly. Consequently, the angle of bank and rate of turn must be progressively increased so that the airplane will have turned 180 degrees at the time it reaches the road. Again, the rollout must be timed so the airplane is in straight and level flight directly over and perpendicular to the road. Throughout the maneuver, a constant altitude should be maintained, and the bank should be changing constantly to effect a true semicircular ground track. Often there is a tendency to increase the bank too rapidly during the initial part of the turn on the upwind side, which will prevent the completion of the 180-degree turn before recrossing the road. This is apparent when the turn is not completed in time for the airplane to cross the road at a perpendicular angle. To avoid this error, the pilot must visualize the desired half-circle ground track and increase the bank during the early part of this turn. During the latter part of the turn, when approaching the road, the pilot must judge the closure rate properly and increase the bank accordingly, so as to cross the road perpendicular to it just as the rollout is completed. Common errors in the performance of S-turns across a road are failure to adequately clear the area, poor coordination, gaining or losing altitude, inability to visualize the half-circle ground track, poor timing in beginning and recovering from turns, faulty correction for drift, inadequate visual lookout for other aircraft. Turns around a point. Turns around a point as a training maneuver is a logical extension of the principles involved in the performance of S-turns across a road. Its purposes as a training maneuver are to further perfect turning technique, to perfect the ability to subconsciously control the airplane while dividing attention between the flight path and ground references, to teach the student that the radius of a turn is a distance which is affected by the degree of bank used when turning with relation to a definite object, to develop a keen perception of altitude, to perfect the ability to correct for wind drift while in turns. In turns around a point, the airplane is flown in 2 or more complete circles of uniform radii or distance from a prominent ground reference point, using a maximum bank of approximately 45 degrees while maintaining a constant altitude. The factors and principles of drift correction that are involved in S-turns are also applicable in this maneuver. As in other ground track maneuvers, a constant radius around a point will, if any wind exists, require a constantly changing angle of bank and angles of wind correction. The closer the airplane is to a direct downwind heading where the ground speed is greatest, the steeper the bank and the faster the rate of turn required to establish the proper wind correction angle. The more nearly it is to a direct upwind heading where the ground speed is least, the shallower the bank and the slower the rate of turn required to establish the proper wind correction angle. It follows, then, that throughout the maneuver, the bank and rate of turn must be gradually varied in proportion to the ground speed. The point selected for turns around a point should be prominent, easily distinguished by the pilot, and yet small enough to present precise reference. See Figure 6-6. Isolated trees, crossroads, or other similar small landmarks are usually suitable. To enter turns around a point, the airplane should be flown on a downwind heading to one side of the selected point at a distance equal to the desired radius of turn. In a high-wing airplane, the distance from the point must permit the pilot to see the point throughout the maneuver, even with the wing lowered in a bank. If the radius is too large, the lowered wing will block the pilot's view of the point. When any significant wind exists, it will be necessary to roll into the initial bank at a rapid rate so that the steepest bank is attained abeam of the point when the airplane is headed directly downwind. By entering the maneuver while heading directly downwind, the steepest bank can be attained immediately. Thus, if a maximum bank of 45 degrees is desired, the initial bank will be 45 degrees if the airplane is at the correct distance from the point. Thereafter, the bank is shallowed gradually until the point is reached where the airplane is headed directly upwind. At this point, the bank should be gradually steepened until the steepest bank is again attained when heading downwind at the initial point of entry. Just as S-turns require that the airplane be turned into the wind in addition to varying the bank, so do turns around a point. During the downwind half of the circle, the airplane's nose is progressively turned toward the inside of the circle. During the upwind half, the nose is progressively turned toward the outside. The downwind half of the turn around the point may be compared to the downwind side of the S-turn across a road. The upwind half of the turn around a point may be compared to the upwind side of the S-turn across a road. As the pilot becomes experienced in performing turns around a point and has a good understanding of the effects of wind drift and varying of the bank angle and wind correction angle as required, entry into the maneuver may be from any point. When entering the maneuver at a point other than downwind, however, the radius of the turn should be carefully selected, taking into account the wind velocity and ground speed, so that an excessive bank is not required later on to maintain the proper ground track. The flight instructor should place particular emphasis on the effect of an incorrect initial bank. This emphasis should continue in the performance of elementary eights. Common errors in the performance of turns around a point are failure to adequately clear the area, failure to establish appropriate bank on entry, failure to recognize wind drift, excessive bank and/or inadequate wind correction angle on the downwind side of the circle, resulting in drift towards the reference point, inadequate bank angle and/or excessive wind correction angle on the upwind side of the circle, resulting in drift away from the reference point, skidding turns when turning from downwind to crosswind, slipping turns when turning from upwind to crosswind, gaining or losing altitude, inadequate visual lookout for other aircraft, inability to direct attention outside the airplane while maintaining precise airplane control. End of Chapter 6, Part 2.